Hello. Recently I went to Ireland. Beautiful place, amazing people, lush and green and ancient and poetic and extremely confusing. Things I was confused by. Northern Ireland, still just there. Part of the UK, border, very hard in theory, very squishy in practice. Up there just destroying the very idea of Brexit. What do you do with a problem like Northern Ireland? Everybody has opinions. No one's opinions are the same as each other. It feels like everybody's just sort of sipping tea over a political landmine, and I love that. I wish that more places in the world could arrive where you are. That's good. But weird, second surprise, many of the roads appear to have been designed by people who enjoy base jumping. Everybody's moving real quick down what appear to be one-lane, two-way roads. I don't know if it's zen, I don't know if it's practice, I don't know if it's just being resigned to your fate, but my biggest surprise is that honestly I thought I was gonna get there and finally I would have found a group of people who knew about the AMOC. In America, I kinda get it. Not thinking about the AMOC very much, but in Ireland, the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation is the thing that makes Europe livable. Because if you look at a map, Ireland is shockingly far north. Dublin is farther north than Calgary, than Quebec City. It is at the same latitude as the southern tip of Alaska. And yet, not snow, rain, not permafrost, sheep. Ireland owes its mild winters to a planetary plumbing system the size and depth of an ocean. The Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, henceforth to be called the AMOC, is a massive loop of water that drags heat from the tropics north all the way to northern Europe and then sends cold water plunging back down in the deep ocean back toward the equator. Without it, Dublin's January would be less like that constant dreary drizzle and more like Siberia. And by the way, one of the most annoying things in the world to me is knowing that a huge number of people will never see news stories about the AMOC simply because of the news sources they read. Which brings me to this video's sponsor, Ground News. Ground News is a remarkable product. It is very easy to use and has so many features that I want to have, including like going to a map and like letting me go to anywhere on the map. I can go to my brother's town and I can say, what's going on in Indianapolis, and swipe around. I can search for the kind of stories I want, and then I can click on them, and I can choose between a number of different organizations that I would like to go. I could check out Phys.org, which I go to all the time, and now I'm actually using Phys.org in a way that doesn't break their business model. And then from here, I can easily like swipe along the bottom and find it on Nature, where I can actually read the paper itself. There's also this amazing blind spot feature that lets me see the kinds of news stories that I normally wouldn't see because they don't hit the places where I go. And check out this story about EPA suspending employees who spoke out against Trump policies. You're going to see a variety of different kinds of headlines. Like we've got the normal AP headline here, but then also we've got Trump-led EPA demonstrates integrity amidst internal rebellion, or EPA staff accused Trump administration of sidelining science. Ground News works with 3 different independent news monitoring organizations to rate bias and factuality of media outlets. Is this work that I could do on my own? Probably, but it's so much easier with them doing it for me. You can subscribe now and get 40% off the Vantage plan by scanning this QR code or using my link at ground.news/Hank. Hot water actually takes up a little bit more space than cold water because it's just jiggling around more, so it knocks into other water molecules more, and that means fewer water molecules in the same volume of water. It's less dense, so it will float on top of cold water. So the water of the tropical ocean is hit up by the equatorial sun that just hits with more energy than if it's doing like glancing blows at the upper latitude, so it just gets hotter there, and that warm layer sort of rides on top of the colder stuff below. Up north, you have a different situation. That water is going to be colder. It's going to be more dense. It's not going to be knocking around as much. And so the molecules slow down, they're closer together, and that's more dense water. These two things on their own, however, are not a big enough difference to set off a giant conveyor belt that's moving trillions of gallons of water a second. There is another factor, a more important factor, and it's salt. As tropical water evaporates under the sun, the salt cannot evaporate. It doesn't go into the sky. It stays there in the ocean. And salt is really good at like nesting cozily inside of water. So when you add salt to water, you only increase its volume a little bit while you increase its mass more. More stuff in less volume means more density. The water is heavier per unit of volume. And because of a few different things, water from the equatorial tropics moves northward. That includes like actual wind currents that are literally blowing the wind northward, but also because that denser water at the top, that colder water, is going to go down into the deep ocean, and that's going to pull something in behind it. And temperature is enough to make that happen like a tiny bit. But that said, sets off something much bigger. Because as the water from the tropics moves northward, it's going to be evaporating that whole way. It's up at the top of the ocean, and you can only evaporate from the top. And as it is evaporating, it is becoming more and more dense because all that salt is being left behind. And so at this point in our history, as it hits kind of the top of the Atlantic Ocean, it plunges down because it's going to be super cold and it's going to be super saline. I mean, not actually super saline. It's going to be comparatively much more saline than water at the tropics. And when that water plunges down, it doesn't just leave like an empty space behind it. We know that. Warm water from the tropics is going to have to rush in to fill that space. It's going to get pulled up from the equator, bringing all of that tropical heat with it. And the greater the density of the water at these northern latitudes, because of both cold and salinity, the more tropical water has to rush northward to replace it as it plunges down into the depths of the Atlantic Ocean. And you might think, even though I have already hinted otherwise, that the big problem we are worried about here is not enough cold to cool down the water to become dense, but no. That's part of the problem, but the bigger problem is Greenland. Greenland is leaking. It's maybe collapsing. I could make a whole episode on Greenland. We're not going to, though. There's a lot of water pouring off of Greenland, and the water pouring off of Greenland today began as snow, frozen vapor that drifted down from the sky that probably initially evaporated from the ocean, leaving the salt behind in the ocean. Snow and rain fall as fresh water. And so now, that snow has compacted into glacial ice over decades and centuries and millennia, storing fresh water way above sea level like a frozen reservoir of pure fresh water. Now, as the climate warms, that ice is melting fast. 250 billion tons of ice per year is melting. All of it is dumping fresh, unsalted water into the ocean. And in the North Atlantic, that's mixing with all of the dense, salty water, and that means that the water is becoming less salty and thus less dense. The more fresh water floods into the North Atlantic, the harder it is for the water to sink. And when the water doesn't sink, the warm current behind it slows down. It isn't yanking on it as hard, and the heat that normally comes with the water does not get delivered. Now, just so you know, this would be bad for everywhere. Why? Because we have built our societies to expect weather to be a certain way, and this would change the weather everywhere. Now, of course, it would particularly change the weather anywhere that is exposed in the northern hemisphere to the Atlantic Ocean, because that's where the AMOC largely operates. Though it's going to affect weather everywhere because it turns out the AMOC interacts with all the other ocean currents, but it is a particularly big effect for things that live in the northern hemisphere and the Atlantic Ocean and land that is exposed to that. For example, in the tropics, the heat that would normally get sucked northward instead gets stuck there and doesn't go anywhere, and that makes things hotter there, which is bad. Let's be honest, it is hot enough down there already, both for the people and the animals. If the AMOC slows down or shuts down, the heat will get stuck in the tropics, but it also won't get delivered to Northern Europe. And the countries most impacted by this are the ones with the most exposure to AMOC, which includes, obviously, Ireland. It's sitting there right on the edge of the Atlantic. I mean, Norway also. They would be hit pretty hard as well, and possibly harder. But at least Norway is like a petro-state, so they kind of deserve it. Sorry, I shouldn't say that, but you are. You gotta admit, Norway. Everybody's like, Norway's so amazing, but like, they got a lot of oil. They're just pumping out and putting in their sovereign wealth fund. Ireland didn't get that. They just have peat, which is not as useful. And also, they already harvested most of it, which they really shouldn't have done, but that's a different video. There's reasons why. One of the things from going to Ireland, I realized, is everything's complicated. But anyway, if the AMOC shuts down, which is a big if, climate change will have caused a surprise cold blob for Northern Europe. So warming climate, but Europe very cold. You've seen Day After Tomorrow. It's like that, except it wouldn't happen like the day after tomorrow, but it would happen very fast. It would happen on the order of like years, not even decades, like maybe a couple of decades. And this system has shut down before. Around 13,000 years ago, the AMOC abruptly shut down, plunging the North Atlantic into a 1,000-year deep freeze called the Younger Dryas. Temperatures in Europe dropped by up to 10 degrees Celsius, which for us Americans is 18 degrees Fahrenheit on average. That means a place that's usually 45 degrees hanging out way above freezing is now way below freezing. I'm talking in Fahrenheit here. And here's the thing. The AMOC might be shutting down. It also might not be. And this is why I am paying so much attention to it. So there was a 2025 study, very recent study from Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution that found no evidence that the AMOC has been weakening over the last 60 years. They were looking at air-sea heat fluxes instead of just surface temperatures, and they say that the AMOC appears more stable than we thought, whereas other recent studies suggest that the AMOC is already weakening, maybe approaching a tipping point, and this is a real tipping point. The AMOC can slow, and that can be linear at first. It could be like, it gets a little bit warmer and a little bit more fresh water, and it slows down and it slows down, but eventually it actually shuts off. And that means that it goes from like slowing to nothing quite quickly. One 2021 paper found early warning signs of this critical transition. Another in 2023 suggested the shutdown could occur this century, possibly as early as 2050. That would be very bad. For Ireland, that means colder, drier summers, stormier in the winter. They and the UK could lose like 5 to 10 degrees Celsius in average temperature. Agriculture on the coast, infrastructure, water systems that developed under a temperate regime would be hit very hard. You have a bunch of people who have never had to worry about their pipes freezing. Suddenly, their pipes are freezing all the time. And there's huge effects outside of that region as well. Rainfall in the tropics would be disrupted. Sea levels along the American East Coast would rise probably significantly because the AMOC currently helps keep them lower. And coral reefs in the tropics, already under stress from bleaching and acidification, would have those problems probably get worse. Heat trapped in the tropics doesn't just make the air warmer, it raises the ocean temperature, and many corals are living just a degree or two below their thermal limit. So even a small shift in ocean heat distribution could push entire reef systems to the brink, especially if they're being disturbed by other things like agricultural or urban runoff or overfishing, killing not just the coral, but the ecosystems and the economies they support. Basically, a lot of modern life is built on this ocean current being stable. That affects the whole world. It affects people in the northern region of the Atlantic Basin the most, and people in Northern Europe, which includes Ireland, the most of all of those people. It is an actual example of a significant tipping point that would have a really severe and significant impact on the people living in the area affected. And because of that, even though I'm not particularly exposed to the Atlantic Basin, I think about the AMOC all the time. Very recently, on June 20th, there was another study with a different result than the Woods Hole study that showed the last century of declines of the AMOC. They talk about this little cold blob that has started to form over the last 100 years off the coast of Ireland. And that blob has been confusing scientists for a long time. It's just this patch of cold water in the Atlantic that refuses to warm up, even as the rest of the Atlantic heats. But now it looks like they have identified the AMOC as the culprit, which has been, a leading theory for a while. They looked at nearly 100 completed climate models with a century of temperature and salinity records, and only the models that showed a weakened AMOC matched what we're seeing in the real world, with colder, fresher water in the subpolar North Atlantic. And if the AMOC really has been weakening for over a century, that means the fuse was lit before we even knew there was a bomb. But for clarity, we are very far away from scientific consensus here. We know that it can happen because it did happen right before the Younger Dryas. It set off the Younger Dryas. That was a bad period for people in Northern Europe. This is not a video about this, but there is a theory that some of the first civilizational work was set off by the Younger Dryas. So this was in Turkey. So Northern Europe basically was completely abandoned. People there either died or they migrated out. And other places where there was a shock, but it was still livable, maybe it set off sort of a period of greater cooperation and sort of cultural building. But let's hope. We can always hope. Point is, different studies are showing different potential futures for the AMOC. We have powerful tools and techniques that are far more powerful than what we had even 50 years ago, but we need more tools. We need more data. We can't fast forward the Earth to see what happens and then go back and adjust based on that. We have to try and do the work to predict the future, which is hard but not impossible. How likely an AMOC shutdown is has huge implications on the costs of climate change and how we will deal with it. And the fact that my federal government is spending less money on studying the Earth, and especially less money on studying climate change, is very worrying to me, because fewer tools is not going to get us where we need to go. So yeah, I thought, okay, in the US, maybe we don't think about the AMOC much because it's just one more thing. At least when I go to Ireland, people will have heard about it. It's right on their front door. But indeed not! So this video is for the Irish and the Norwegians and also the people anywhere in Europe. It's not just going to be the coastal areas affected if the AMOC shuts down. And of course, also everybody else who's watching this, I'm very glad that you now know more about the AMOC. I really hope that we keep it chugging along for another 12,000 years. As Greenland continues to melt, this seems less and less likely, but let's hope that it's like Woods Hole study stable and not UC Riverside stable, but we just don't know, and we need to figure this out. And for clarity, there probably are gonna be people who are mad at me for saying that we don't know, because they feel like we do know one way or the other, but that's the thing. People who are really well educated on this and study it professionally disagree with each other. And the next time you see a news story about the AMOC, I hope you'll click on it because it's one of the bigger stories of the 21st century. And I really hope it turns out okay, but it is something to actually be keeping an eye on. Everybody's like, asteroids. And I'm like, oh my God, AMOC.